All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into a historical event that never seems to get old. The Battle of the Little Bighorn.
Yeah, this one's a real head scratcher.
We've got a mountain of sources here. Excerpts from all sorts of historical texts, firsthand accounts, you name it, even some archaeological findings to shed some light on the whole thing.
Oh, cool. Like actual artifacts from the battlefield.
You bet. We're going to try to unravel the events leading up to the battle, see if we can understand both sides of the story.
That's always tricky, right? Getting the full picture.
Absolutely. Plus, we're going to uncover some little-known facts that really turn that classic Custer's Last Stand narrative on its head. And believe me, there are some seriously surprising details buried in here.
Oh, I bet. Lay it on me. What kind of surprises?
Well, for starters, even the name of the battle is up for debate.
Really? What do you mean? It's Custer's Last Stand, right? That's what everyone calls it.
That's what most people know it as, yeah. But the Lakota, they called it something else entirely.
Huh, interesting. What do they call it?
They called it the Battle of the Greasy Grass.
The Battle of the Greasy Grass.
Oh.
Wow, that's a world of difference right there.
Right. And that difference, right from the get-go, tells you we're dealing with two very different perspectives on the same event.
And whose perspective is usually the one that gets told?
Exactly. And it's that clash of perspectives that we're going to be exploring today.
Sounds like a recipe for some good historical debate. So, set the scene for me. When did this all go down? What was the backdrop?
All right, so picture this. 1876, the Great Sioux War is in full swing. Tensions are sky high between, well, basically everyone. You've got the Lakota, the Cheyenne, other Native American tribes, all clashing with the U.S. government.
Yeah, classic westward expansion clash, right? Native Americans versus the relentless push of the settlers?
You got it. And the government just kept pushing further and further into their territory. Treaties were broken. Promises were tossed aside. It was a recipe for disaster.
Okay, so we've got broken treaties, land disputes, and a simmering resentment on both sides. Anything else fueling this powder keg?
Oh, you bet. And to make things even more complex, the battle didn't even happen on land that originally belonged to the Lakota.
Wait, what? Really? Whose land was it then?
They had actually taken it from the Crow tribe a few decades earlier. So you've got this whole other layer of conflict that often gets overlooked.
Wow. So it's even more complicated than just the usual cowboys and Indians narrative.
Right. And the U.S. government, well, they knew how to exploit those existing tensions. It was a classic divide and conquer strategy, pitting tribes against each other to weaken their resistance.
So they were playing both sides, huh? Talk about adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
And wasn't there something about the Black Hills being a major flashpoint?
Oh, absolutely. The Black Hills were sacred to the Lakota. The U.S. government had actually promised them this land in a treaty. But guess what? Gold was discovered, and those promises went right out the window.
Figures. Gold rush trumps treaty every time, right?
Yeah.
That must have really stoked the flames of resentment.
It absolutely did. Imagine that. Your sacred land, promised to you, suddenly overrun by prospectors and settlers all clamoring for gold.
Yeah, that's a recipe for war if I've ever heard one.
Ah.
So how did it actually escalate from broken treaties and land disputes to a full-blown war?
Well, in 1876, the U.S. Army decided to play hardball. They launched a massive campaign to force the Lakota and Cheyenne back onto reservations.
Oh, so a forced relocation. Sounds like they weren't messing around. What was their strategy?
They went with what they called a three-pronged approach. 3 columns of soldiers were supposed to converge on the tribes from different directions, like closing a trap.
A three-pronged attack? That sounds pretty intimidating. Did it work?
Not quite. In fact, one of those prongs kind of backfired spectacularly. The Battle of the Rosebud happened just a few weeks before the Little Bighorn. General Crook's column, one of the 3 prongs, ran into a much larger force of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors than they expected. They got their butts kicked and had to retreat.
Ooh, a surprise defeat for the U.S. Army. That must have thrown a wrench into their plans.
A major wrench. And remember, back then, communication wasn't instant like it is today. So this loss of coordination, this element of surprise, well, it really set the stage for what was to come at the Little Bighorn.
Okay, so this Battle of the Rosebud, definitely a turning point. It shifted the momentum, created chaos and confusion, and it set the scene for Custer's last stand, or should I say, the Battle of the Greasy Grass.
Exactly. Now let's talk about Custer and his infamous 7th Cavalry. Because the image we have, the romanticized last stand image, well, let's just say there's a whole lot more to the story.
Okay, spill the tea. What's the real deal with Custer and his men?
Well, the 7th Cavalry was a mix. You had veteran soldiers from the Civil War, tough and experienced, but also newer recruits who were, let's say, less seasoned.
A mix of old hands and greenhorns. That's always an interesting dynamic. Were they at least well equipped?
Oh yeah, they had good equipment, no doubt. But some sources suggest that many of the troopers weren't exactly in peak physical condition before the battle.
Really? You'd think being in top shape would be a priority for a cavalry unit, wouldn't you?
You'd think so, right? But remember, this was a time of big changes for the U.S. Army. They were adjusting to new ways of fighting.
Growing pains, huh? So even though they had good equipment, maybe they weren't as fit as they could have been? And how many soldiers did Custer actually have under his command at Little Bighorn?
That's another detail that often gets overlooked. While the 7th Cavalry was a decent-sized regiment, about 22% of Custer's men were actually assigned to other tasks and weren't there.
Hold on, so almost a quarter of his men were missing. That's a big chunk. That had to have an impact.
Oh, absolutely. He went into the battle with far fewer troops than he was expecting. And on top of that, he was working with some seriously bad intel.
Bad intel? Like what?
He actually thought he was only up against about 800 Native Americans.
800? Are you kidding me?
Nope. And that was a huge miscalculation, a colossal intelligence failure. He was actually facing thousands of warriors. Thousands.
Yikes. That's not just bad intel. That's a recipe for disaster. I mean, you're already going in with fewer men than you planned, and then you find out you're vastly outnumbered.
It was a major blunder, for sure. And some historians believe that Custer's ambition, his desire for glory, might have clouded his judgment a bit.
So maybe a little too much bravado, not enough caution.
Perhaps. He seemed more focused on preventing the Lakota and Cheyenne from escaping than engaging in a direct fight. There's even a quote from John Martin, Custer's bugler, where he says Custer's biggest concern was to cut them off and capture them.
So he was aiming for a quick, decisive victory. A classic Custer move from what I've heard. But was that even realistic given the circumstances? I mean, outnumbered, bad intel, and potentially not as fit as they should have been?
It was a gamble, that's for sure. A gamble that didn't pay off.
And to make matters worse, he decided to divide his already depleted forces, right?
Yeah, he split his 12 companies into 3 battalions, Reno's, Benteen's, and his own. And the orders he gave Reno, well, let's just say they set the stage for a whole lot of chaos.
What do you mean? What was so bad about the orders?
He basically sent Reno in blind, told him to charge the village without any real knowledge of how big it was or how many warriors they were facing.
So, a charge into the unknown, that sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
It was a recipe for disaster, and, well, disaster is exactly what they got. Reno's charge quickly devolved into a chaotic retreat. They were totally overwhelmed by the sheer number of warriors they encountered.
Okay, so Reno's men are getting hammered. They're outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and forced into a desperate retreat. Where was Benteen during all this? Shouldn't he have been coming to the rescue?
Well, Benteen arrived with his battalion just as Reno's men were falling back. He could hear heavy gunfire coming from Custer's direction, but instead of pushing forward to help him, he chose to reinforce Reno's position on the bluffs.
Hold on, he heard gunfire and didn't go to help. Why on earth would he do that? Seems like a pretty crucial moment to abandon your commanding officer.
You'd think so, right? That decision has been debated by historians for years. Some say he disobeyed orders. Others argue it was a tactical decision based on what he knew at the time.
So we've got bad intel, a divided force, and now a potential disobedience of orders. This isn't looking good for Custer. So while all of this is going on with Reno and Benteen, where's Custer? What's he up to?
That's where we shift our focus to what's become known as Custer's last stand. But as we'll see, that traditional narrative of a heroic, unified last stand, well, the evidence tells a different story.
Oh, I knew there had to be more to it. This is where it gets really interesting. What does the evidence tell us about Custer's final moments? Let's unravel this last stand.
Let's do it.
Well, it's tough because with no survivors from Custer's battalion, a lot of what we know is really just speculation and interpretation.
Yeah, like trying to solve a mystery with only half the clues, right?
Exactly. But thankfully, we've got archaeological findings and the stories passed down through Lakota and Cheyenne oral histories to help fill in some blanks.
So we're piecing together the puzzle with what we've got. What are some of the theories out there about what happened to Custer?
One of the most interesting theories is that Custer may have actually tried to cross the Little Bighorn River.
Cross the river. Where and why would he do that?
There's a spot called Medicine Tail Coulee. Some historians believe he was trying to pull off a surprise attack on the village from the north.
While Reno was attacking from the south, like a pincer movement.
Right, a classic pincer movement. But things didn't exactly go according to plan.
I'm guessing not. If they did, we wouldn't be talking about Custer's last stand, would we?
Probably not. The evidence points to Custer's forces being divided, maybe even into as many as three smaller groups. And they faced fierce resistance from the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors.
So instead of this grand, unified last stand, it was more like a series of smaller, desperate fights.
That seems to be the case. There's evidence of fighting on Calhoun Hill, where they might have tried to form a skirmish line, and on Custer Hill, where they used dead horses as barricades.
Wow, dead horses as barricades. That's pretty grim. Sounds like they were really up against it.
They were in a dire situation, that's for sure. Remember, Custer expected a much smaller force. He was probably hoping to catch them by surprise.
And instead, he got a nasty surprise himself.
Right. The Lakota and Cheyenne were ready for them, and they fought back with incredible strength and determination.
Well, yeah, they were defending their homes, their families, their entire way of life.
Exactly. They had everything to lose. I read that they even used some pretty clever tactics to disrupt the 7th Cavalry, like using blankets to spook the horses.
That's smart. Kind of psychological warfare, right?
Exactly. They knew the cavalry depended on their horses for speed and maneuverability. Spooking the horses would create chaos and disrupt those formations.
It's amazing how resourceful they were.
Yeah. It speaks to their understanding of their enemy's weaknesses. They weren't just fighting bravely, they were fighting smart. So yeah, that image of a unified last stand is definitely being challenged by the evidence. And those accounts from the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, they're so important in understanding what really went down.
Absolutely. Their perspective is crucial in filling in the gaps. What do those accounts tell us about Custer's last moments?
Well, there's a famous account from a Lakota warrior named White Cow Bull. He claimed to have shot Custer off his horse while he was trying to cross the river.
Hold on, so Custer might have been wounded even before the final fight on Custer Hill.
That's what White Cow Bull's account suggests. He said he shot a leader wearing a buckskin jacket, which Custer was known for wearing. Now, we can't confirm this account definitively, but it's a fascinating piece of the puzzle.
It really is. And it throws a wrench in that classic image of Custer, bravely leading a last stand.
Right, it adds a whole new layer of complexity to the story. And while we may never know exactly how Custer met his end, we do know his entire battalion was wiped out, no survivors.
And that lack of first-hand accounts from Custer's side, it's fueled so much of the speculation and debate over the years.
Absolutely, it's like a historical mystery novel with missing pages. But even without those missing pages, it seems like the archaeological evidence and the Native American accounts were giving us a much more complex and likely more accurate picture of what happened than that traditional last stand narrative.
We're getting closer to the truth, or at least a more nuanced version of it. So while all of this was happening with Custer and his men, what was going on with Reno and Benteen? They were still hunkered down on Reno Hill, right?
Yes, they were pinned down for almost 2 days. Wave after wave of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors kept attacking. It must have been terrifying, knowing that Custer's battalion had been wiped out.
I can only imagine. They must have been wondering if they were next. Did they manage to hold their position?
They did, but it wasn't easy. They suffered heavy casualties.
So how did it finally end for them? Did they fight their way out?
Actually, General Terry arrived with reinforcements. That forced the Lakota and Cheyenne to withdraw.
Talk about a sight for sore eyes. Those reinforcements must have been a huge relief for Reno and Benteen. They were literally fighting for their lives.
It was a turning point in the battle, for sure. But it's important to remember the psychological toll on the surviving soldiers. They had just witnessed the complete annihilation of Custer's battalion and barely escaped with their own lives.
That kind of trauma stays with you. We often focus on the physical casualties of war, but the unseen wounds, the psychological ones, those can be just as devastating.
Absolutely. And those wounds aren't always visible, which can make them even harder to heal.
So the battle ends with the arrival of General Terry. But what about the bigger picture? How did the Battle of the Little Bighorn affect the relationship between the U.S. and Native American tribes?
Well, in the short term, it was a major victory for the Lakota and Cheyenne.
A testament to their skill and their determination to defend their land.
Exactly. But it was a victory that came at a terrible cost. And unfortunately, the long-term consequences were devastating. The Battle of the Little Bighorn really shook the nation. It was a huge blow to the U.S. Army's pride.
And it probably fueled a desire for revenge.
Oh, absolutely. It became the symbol of resistance that the U.S. government was determined to crush. The public was outraged. And that led to even more military pressure and a renewed push to subdue the Native American tribes.
So even though the Lakota and Cheyenne won this battle, it kind of backfired in the long run.
It's a tragic irony. The U.S. government was determined to prevent another defeat like that, so they poured more resources and manpower into the conflict, which eventually led to the forced removal of the Lakota and Cheyenne from their lands and their confinement to reservations.
That's heartbreaking. It seems like the Battle of the Little Bighorn, even though it was a significant moment of resistance, ultimately marked a turning point in the conflict.
It did. It led to the loss of their remaining land, including the sacred Black Hills and the erosion of their way of life.
A tragic chapter in American history, to say the least, and one with repercussions that are still felt today. Yeah, it's a stark reminder that the consequences of conflict, of any conflict really, they reach far beyond the actual battlefield. This wasn't just about one battle. It was about the survival of entire cultures, ways of life.
And that struggle, it hasn't gone away. Take the Black Hills, for example.
Right. Still a major point of contention.
The Sioux Nation, they never accepted the U.S. government taking those lands. And they've been fighting to get them back for over a century.
It's crazy how long this fight has been going on. And it all goes back to that clash of perspectives we were talking about earlier.
Right.
For so long, this event has been known as Custer's Last Stand. It's always been told from the U.S. Army's point of view.
It's amazing how much power those dominant narratives have. For generations, Custer was seen as this heroic figure, almost a martyr for westward expansion. But as we've seen, it's way more complicated than that.
Makes you wonder how many other stories are out there waiting to be told or maybe retold with a more accurate, inclusive perspective.
It's a good reminder that history is always being re-examined, reinterpreted. As new evidence comes up, perspectives shift, and we get closer to a more complete understanding.
It's a constant process. So, zooming out a bit, what does all of this mean for us today? Why should we care about a battle that happened almost 150 years ago?
The Battle of the Little Bighorn, it offers some valuable lessons about leadership, about clear communication, and the dangers of underestimating your opponent.
Those are definitely timeless lessons.
It also forces us to look at some of the darker parts of our history, those broken treaties, the injustices done to Native American tribes. It's not a pretty picture.
It's a reminder that history isn't just names and dates in a textbook. It's about the choices people made, the ripple effects of those choices, and how those effects can last for generations.
And the story of the Little Bighorn, it's still part of our culture today. We see it in books and movies, monuments and memorials. It's become a symbol, both of American military might and the tragic consequences of that clash of cultures.
It's a story that continues to fascinate and challenge us. Well, this has been an incredible deep dive, to say the least.
It really has.
We've uncovered some surprising facts, challenged some of those traditional narratives, and gained a much deeper understanding of this pivotal event in American history.
I think the biggest takeaway here is that history is never truly settled. It's a conversation that's always going on. There's always more to learn, more to understand.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening, we encourage you to keep exploring this story. Dig into those sources, look for different perspectives, and come to your own conclusions about this battle that still captivates us today.
The Battle of the Greasy Grass, as the Lakota knew it, it's a powerful reminder of the complexity of the past, the importance of those different perspectives, and the lasting legacy of our history.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.